All right, so we're gonna jump right in because y'all know I don't stay up this late to be on to be on a live.
Yeah.
I got my cushion under me, so I've been doing back exercises and stretches, so I think I'll be okay. But I don't want to test my luck. I want to make sure I say your name right.
Yeah. So basically, my name is Arun. So Arun is my actual name. Anno just means older brother in Tamil.
Okay.
So it is literally like my branding is quite literally just Tamil Indian Hasanabi. So that is quite literally my branding. That's what most people know me as. Like they just know me as the Indian Hasanabi. So it's basically because I cover like Indian, Sri Lankan, Pakistani, Nepali, Bangladeshi, that general like section of the world.
Gotcha. And so tonight, Arun, did I say that?
Yeah, you don't have to roll the R, but yeah, Arun is
because
actually,
I am not good at rolling R's.
Yeah, you don't have to roll your R. You can just say Arun. Arun is fine.
Arun.
Yeah.
So Arun reached out to me actually by way of Andrewism, way back when, because you were doing that type of work, and in between, videos about the manosphere and whatever Kanye West, I want to try to engage in politics in a way that I think is useful, especially with the platform I've been blessed with. And one thing I know I'm very weak on is international politics. Like I just don't pay attention. I just don't have the capacity, let alone the expertise. And so Arun reached out some time ago about a project he was trying to get more attention to, that I agreed to participate in, and then somehow the day of forgot the time, got the time mixed up, and said, okay, well, to make up for that, we're going to bring you to my platform to try to repeat the same activity. In my lead up to this, though, I was kind of struck with how familiar this story is. So Arun is doing work looking into a genocide that happened in Sri Lanka less than 2 decades ago, like within our lifetime, which is within everybody here's lifetime.
So the way I look at the word genocide is that it's an ongoing process. It's not like it doesn't start or end with one particular event.
Right.
That's usually how genocides go. It's never just like one simple event. It's always like it is always like any measure to further marginalize a section of people that have been, already marginalized even further. It's a way of removing them of any sort of rights or political power. That's usually the way I look at it.
Right. So I guess the thing that so I got a little bit from you when we talked, but the documentary I watched didn't give a ton. One thing I'm interested in is like the background structure to this. So we're talking about, Southeast Asia. We're talking about Sri Lanka, which was a British colony at some point. Correct? Was it British? Or
so it was colonized 3 times. So one was by the Portuguese, one was by the Dutch, and then finally it was by the British.
Okay. And then it's decolonized, or at least given independence at a certain point. And then as what happens with like these, I'm thinking about the Congo, I'm thinking about the Caribbean, I'm thinking about a lot of nations. Once they're decolonized, just because the white folks left, the damage done to the unique intercommunity relationships leaves it ripe for conflict that is then exacerbated in a lot of ways. And so if you could just lay that groundwork.
So I can basically give an understanding of what the demographics of the island are. So in Sri Lanka, you basically have 4 major ethnic groups. So the largest of the ethnic groups are Sinhalese. So they roughly form about 3/4 of the population. The second largest minority are a group of Tamils called the Elam Tamils, or the Sri Lankan Tamils. And these guys have been on the island for roughly hundreds, if not about 1,000 or so years, right? They've been here a very long time. The third group are Muslims on the island whose mother tongue is also Tamil. And then the fourth ethnic group are Malayaga Tamils, or the estate Tamils, the hill Tamils. And this demographic was entirely created by the British. Because what these guys are the descendants of South Indian laborers that were brought to the island by the British from India to basically work tea plantations. So there's an entire demographic in Sri Lanka that is entirely cooked up due to the British, right? That suffers a lot because of their class position, but also sort of their ethnic position as well. The Sinhalese are concentrated largely in the south and the west portions of the country. So Colombo, Sri Jayawardhanapura Kotte, Hambantota, like those cities are predominantly Sinhalese. The Elam Tamil dominated areas are basically the north and sort of the northeast. So this is like Jaffna, Trincomalee, Vaunia, Kilinochchi, so on and so forth, right? In terms of religion, the Sinhalese are predominantly Buddhist with a minority of Christians. The Tamils are majority Hindus with a minority of Christians and a minority of Buddhists. The Muslims are basically an ethno-religious group. They're Muslims. And then finally, the Malayaga Tamils are largely, the estate Tamils are also largely Hindu. So those are generally the demographics of the island. So the way sort of the British kind of intervened in Sri Lanka, it's not just the British actually. There was also American presence in Sri Lanka as well. So the way it worked was the American missionaries actually set up. These are largely, I believe, Catholic missionaries. Set up like education centers. They set up schools, but because at the time the British, was largely concerned with the South, they kind of did not permit the American missionaries to build those centers there. They actually sent them to the north. They basically sent them to the north for the most part. And then what happened was there was some meddling there, and that's basically how that's kind of how the tension started a little bit. You also had basically the development of both Tamil nationalism and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, which kind of directly corresponded to the Christian missionary work that was present in Sri Lanka as well.
And when you say corresponded, do you mean like was influenced by, or was a response against?
It's the second one. They rose as a response against, basically. Gotcha.
So the thing that I immediately started thinking about when we talked about this was the Rwandan genocide, and how basically you have a colonized nation with its own set of historical and ethnic elements and forces. The colonizer comes in and sets up a program that is most beneficial to it, which creates which sets the table for a lot of conflict between the people that are colonized, as certain entities are uplifted, civilized, whatever terms they want to use, and different conflicts are set up through that action, and those conflicts then spill out after it's over. And this kind of happened in Haiti. I'm assuming it kind of happened here, and that's what happened in Rwanda, where after the fact, and it's just one of the things I always kind of want to keep preeminent, despite the horrible things that I know we're going to get into, is that all of this starts with the state of colonization from these and this is, and again, this recent imperial core activity, like not that long ago. Was this within our lifetime? And so the nation decolonizes, and there's conflict between, from my understanding, the North and Northeastern Tamil nation or forces and the Sinhalese forces in the South. And it's what I ascertained from the documentary. By the way, so it's a documentary. I guess I'll put it in the description whenever this drops, and I'll send it. Bellamy, that actually sent that to you if you want to put it in the chat. Be warned, this is a very graphic documentary of what happened here. So this is not for in any way the faint of heart or constitution, because it's a direct.
It's gruesome.
Visual. It's gruesome.
It's some of the most gruesome things you'll see in a while.
Right. Can you kind of, as best you can, explain what the conflict was between these two entities?
So basically, I think a lot of people have framed it as like a Tamils versus Sinhalese sort of thing. That's really not what's going on here. It's basically, well, yes and no. Basically, to let's rewind a second, right? So basically, when the British kind of leave Sri Lanka, right? So sort of the understanding of how the ruling like class actually worked at the time. Once the British left, there was already like an aristocratic, like effectively, like these are, very aristocratic families that have run Sri Lanka for decades on end. In fact, Sri Lanka doesn't become a republic until the 1970s. So it's actually basically under the same sort of status that Canada and Australia are in right now. It's a Commonwealth realm.
Gotcha.
And the reason for that is basically the way Sri Lanka got its quote unquote independence is not through the same. It's not actually the Sri Lanka is actually kind of interesting in that it doesn't get independence the same way that India does. India actually got its independence through a lot of violence and bloodshed, and basically the British realizing it's no longer profitable to actually, hold India, and that's where they basically do the I forgot his name already, but the guy basically divvies up the line between India and Pakistan, right? Mm-hmm. But Sri Lanka, that doesn't happen, right? So what happens is the British basically kind of install power that is effectively still like kind of British proxies in the form of the Senanayake family as well as the Bandaranaike family, in the sense of like both of them come from very aristocratic families. They have their own sort of I was thinking of Cyril Radcliffe, but basically in Sri Lanka, you have, especially at the beginning after 1948, you effectively have the Senanayake family, which creates the United National Party, which is basically right wing. And then you have Bandaranaike, Solomon Bandaranaike, who comes into that UNP party, the United National Party. And then basically he sees an opportunity because he himself comes from, he comes from a very aristocratic family, that aristocratic Sinhalese family. And he basically decides to form his own party. And I'm oversimplifying everything here because it's a 1 hour call, but right. He forms his own party called the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. And his party starts passing laws such as the Sinhala Only Act. So basically, this is an instance where the Sinhalese dominant government basically passed a law which made the Sinhala language the only official language of what was then called the Dominion of Ceylon at the time. And what this actually did is it specifically excluded Tamil as an official language. So at this point in time, Tamil-speaking minorities, they formed 30% of the population at this point in time. So what that means is 30% of the population is no longer allowed to get government jobs. And on top of that, you basically have a lot of initiatives by basically Sinhalese nationalist-controlled parties to effectively reduce the amount of power that Tamils had in terms of representation. This is targeted towards the Malayaga Tamils. So one example is that both Sirima and I think I might be wrong about this, but Solomon Bandaranaike both made a lot of the Malayaga Tamils that that are in the center, the descendants of the landless laborers, right? They made them stateless. That's an example of that. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, you had a concerted effort throughout the middle of the 20th century to basically disenfranchise the Tamils wherever they may be. So there was racial agitation against so there were multiple pogroms that were committed against the Tamils in the 1950s, I think one in the 70s, and then in the 80s, there's actually two. One was in 1981, where in Jaffna, you had basically fascist mobs, which were basically backed by the cops at the time, because in Sri Lanka, the way it works is the cops are they're basically federally controlled. There's never been any devolution of powers with regards to land or policing to the provincial level. Mm-hmm. So even in the north, you had basically Sinhalese cops that were policing Tamils. And in 1981, what happened was the Jaffna Public Library was set on fire. And there were priceless cultural artifacts, thousands-year-old artifacts in Jaffna that were basically, destroyed up in smoke. We're never getting them back. So this is an act of cultural genocide against the Tamils. And then in 1983, an incident called Black July happened in July of 1983, you had fascist mobs in Sri Lanka that got the addresses of Tamil-owned businesses, Tamil-owned homes, through voter rolls provided to them by higher ups in the government. And what they did is they set them on fire. They set Tamil-owned businesses on fire. They burned Tamil-owned homes. And massive trigger warning. We're going to get into this because it is not fun to talk about. But we are talking about massive, we're talking about sexual assault against men, women, and children, mass murder. So another thing that happened in Black July was you had fascists literally come out and word test people. So one of the things that they did is they would ask people, random people on the street, they would ask them to say a word in Sinhala. And if there was a Tamil accent or they couldn't say it, they would beat them to death on the spot. So you had a lot of horrific incidents. This is the beginning of the Civil War.
In the 80s.
This was in the 80s, yeah. This was the beginning of the Civil War period, where there was basically a 25-year-long Civil War. I know someone in the audience. I know that person. I think it's important to realize, to sort of break things up into chronological orders. That's why I'm saying Civil War. But I understand what effectively happened. What is continuing to happen in Sri Lanka is a genocide against the Tamils.
Right. Because to call it a civil war implies more, I guess, intentionality other than survival.
The reason I use the term civil war is largely because it's just to break it up it's just to break it up based on chronology. That's about it. Right. But there's no doubt, any shred of doubt about what is happening to the Tamils. That is not no, it is obviously a genocide. Basically from 1983 to 2009, for a while, originally you had a bunch of militant Tamil organizations that were fighting against the Sri Lankan government. You also had a communist uprising somewhere in the middle by the JVP. We'll get to sort of the efficacy of communist parties and why I'm not a big fan of them. There was it lasted for 25 years. And in 2009, especially in the May, area, in the May time, right? In May 2009, at this point in time, a guy called Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected to power. He was a president at this point in time. And he was elected on the promise that he would end the war at all costs, right? He would end everything at all costs. That obviously implies that he's going to commit war crimes. That's not even a question. And so what he did was in 2009, what he first did was he actually forced the intergovernmental organizations out of that region. Not just him, but his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his entire government. Effectively, what they did was they warned the NGOs saying, we cannot guarantee working in the northern parts of the region. Basically saying if you do not leave, we cannot ensure your safety. Now, that is the stated reason, right? The real reason they wanted those intergovernmental organizations out was because they didn't want any witnesses. That's the real reason. So a bulk of what happened in 2009 was these no-fire zones were set up towards the end of the Civil War. And what these no-fire zones were basically zones where neither the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, nor the Sri Lankan government were supposed to fire into these zones. And during these zones, what happened was makeshift hospitals were set up. One thing that happened was the Sri Lankan government basically prevented medical supplies from going into those war-affected zones, into those no-fire zones, right? And so basically what they did is they shelled those makeshift hospitals, and they basically corralled people. I'm basically selling it short. What they did is they intentionally corralled people into these no-fire zones as much as possible to mass bomb them, to shell them as much as possible. And one of the
I'm sorry if I could interject, just kind of for those who don't want to suffer through the documentary. This is one of the more affecting elements that stuck with me is exactly what Arun is saying. I think they said at least 65 times within was it a couple of weeks?
It was
these
like
hospitals
a couple
were
of weeks
bombed
in a month,
65 times in the no-fire zone. And they kept, I the only thing I could think of was one of these like Fortnite where they kept closing the area down And
Yeah.
as they murdered more people, they would say, okay, well, then this is the new zone. Everybody come to this zone. And then they would bomb that zone, and shell that zone, which is where some of the more gruesome stuff in the film comes from. So sorry to interrupt, but continue.
Yeah, so it's like you said. Basically, what the Sri Lankan government was trying to do was they were trying to corner the LTTE, which at this point became the dominant rebel group in the region. So they wanted to basically they wanted to corner the LTTE at all costs. And so what happened was the Red Cross, basically as per protocol, was giving out coordinates, the coordinates of these makeshift hospitals. So the reason that the Sri Lankan government actually knew the location of these hospitals was they were using the coordinates that the Red Cross, the ICRC, were giving as per protocol. The bombing of those hospitals became so systematic. It became so regular that the ICRC was literally, the Red Cross was literally asked to stop providing coordinates because people are getting killed. What we're seeing here was, at best we can say it is an international failure among every country involved, and there's a litany of countries that are involved in this, right?
Yeah.
Like every country you've probably heard on CNN is involved in this. And by the way, they did not discriminate. So
it was anybody. It was literally whoever is there can get it. It was men, women, children, doctors.
Oh yeah, it was rough. It was definitely horrifying. It is genuinely some of the most horrifying things I've seen in my life. One of the tactics that the Sri Lankan government would actually use was they would basically fire off a round of shelling, right, and kill a bunch of people. They would murder a bunch of people. And what they would do is they would fire a round within like 5-10 minutes of that. So you had people that were literally waiting, that had to wait 30 minutes because what they would do is the Sri Lankan government would lure out people that were coming up to pick up the corpses of their dead relatives so that they can carry them back into the trenches. The trenches that they were dug, that were dug. You had people hiding in trenches too, right?
Yeah.
So you had, that's one of the things that the Sri Lankan government did. This all culminates in something called the Mullivaikkal massacre. So they managed to finally corner the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, into a town called Mullivaikkal, which also contains a lot of civilians and contains a lot of schools where the makeshift hospital was set up. But this all culminates on May 18th, 2009, where the LTTE was routed, and along with them, several civilians were massacred. And on top of that, many LTTE fighters were captured, along with civilians as well. And they were mass tortured and mass raped by the Sri Lankan army. And a lot of them, and a bunch of others were also rounded up and disappeared. And we haven't heard from them since, right? In fact, Sri Lanka has I believe, the second highest number of forced disappearances of any country in the world. And that's after Syria or Iraq. So this should give you an idea of like what kind of precarious situation Sri Lanka is in. After the civil war ended, after the fighting ended, after the conflict time ended, the military basically stayed there. There was an occupation. There continues to be an occupation. And even up until today, there are landmines scattered throughout the north. So there are areas that are just sectioned off for civilians, either due to the military's presence, or there are landmines in those fields. On top of that, there's also there's a lot of people that were displaced, and there's a lot more I could get into, but I've said a lot here. I just want to like let people like
take all that in.
Yeah.
Now I get it. I don't even know where to jump in, to be honest. It's just a wild. I guess
I can like interject with this. The reason I know about this is because I saw the war crimes for myself happen on TV. Like, so just for the record, just so everyone is clear, I'm not from Sri Lanka. My family is all Indian, so we're all from Tamils. Actually, so I've framed Tamils as this, right? So Tamils are actually, they live in Sri Lanka, right? But the vast majority of Tamils worldwide actually live in India, in this state of Tamil Nadu. So my family is from the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. So we're from the southern state, right, of Tamil Nadu.
So it's a diasporic type situation.
So we're actually, yeah, Tamils are actually native to both Sri Lanka and India. So
Okay.
So we're actually, so my entire family is from India. I'm from a city called Chennai. But the reason that I know about this is because they showed this, like Tamil News Network showed this, and we saw that stuff. Like my parents were watching that stuff in like when I was a kid growing up. So I saw, and just to give you an example of what I saw, so the leader of the LTTE, he was the same age as me, right? His name is Balachandran Prabhakaran, right? He was 12. I was 12 at the time. Basically, there's footage or there's images that showed the Sri Lankan army basically having captured this 12-year-old kid, having tied him up, and they were feeding him biscuits. And then the next image is basically him dead on the ground with 5 holes through his chest because he was shot at point blank range by the Sri Lankan army.
And so that you speaking to like witnessing this imagery, I guess is kind of the only real honest, if I'm honest about what's going through my head, is like how little things like this are known and understood outside of the spaces that are most affected. How like this is a recent event. This is in both of our lifetimes, probably everybody's lifetime within the chat. And had you not reached out to me, I'd have never known that was the case. As far as I know, Sri Lanka is just a great tourist place. You know,
no, that's not your fault. That's literally Sri Lanka's MO.
Right.
Like Sri Lanka is a country that is heavily reliant on tourism. Yeah, it's like Abhirupan says, right? That image of Prabhakaran's son literally eating biscuits, like not like biscuits, but like cookies, right? That, like him eating that and then just seeing him dead on the floor, like with like literally like a second later is horrifying. Like, and I saw that when I was like 13, 14.
I have a similar experience with Yummy Sandifer that I've talked about on multiple occasions.
So you get it. Yeah, exactly.
I get the concept.
Yeah, is horrifying. Yeah. So like, and that's one of the things that they did. Another is the case of Isaipriya. So Isaipriya was a newscaster for the rebel LTTE. So she was actually an artist before that. And a lot of the Tamils in the audience will immediately shiver the moment I said Isaipriya. And so what happened was she was basically captured by the she was captured by the Sri Lankan army. And effectively what happened was she was effectively she was raped, and she was tied up and she was thrown into a ditch. She was and then
that was in the documentary.
Yeah.
Okay, I was trying to make sure.
Yep, that was in the documentary, and you see her body in that documentary. Basically, she is dead and she's in a ditch, right? And she's tied up and she does not have any clothes on. It gets worse. I mean, we're already like knee deep.
We're deep in here, so
we're already knee deep in here. But one of the Sri Lankan soldiers at the time was noted to have been saying in Sinhala, "I would like to fuck it again." Like after like insinuating that I would like to, I don't have to spell it out.
Right. That was one of the things that threw me, was hearing, like I almost didn't want to believe the translations that I was reading on the documentary.
Yeah.
Now I know from my own, minimal historical knowledge that like war creates monstrosities out of humans in terms of what they're capable of doing.
Yeah.
But you don't get like, because this happened in 2009, they had cell phone footage, right? Because like I'm thinking about, we go back to the Rwanda genocide, we go back to numerous local conflicts across Africa and South America, and all of these imperial exterior nations that have been kind of pushed into these dire straits, and thus the people have had to like you talked about this image being etched into your brain, but like it's etched into your brain a different way when you're like there and you're like a child soldier, right? It's hard to like reason through that type of inhumane action. You know, it blows my mind is the best way I could really speak to without getting into like language and conversations that I don't know are fitting for the situation. But to hear some of the things that they were saying as they were dragging dead bodies, as they were shooting people that were already tied up, so committing active war crimes.
Yeah,
you know, when we talk about these types of conflicts, it's kind of stunning. I don't have a very intelligent, have much intelligence to offer other than just like how stunning it is that was real. You know what I'm saying? And probably that's the tip of the iceberg of what we are able to ascertain. That's what we have footage of. You know, we don't even have footage of the realities around it. For those who are asking, if you could throw it in the chat again, for those who want to kind of like see it for themselves, it's called the Sri Lankan Killing Fields. It's shorter than one of my videos, but way more brutal.
Yeah, it's like there really isn't like, again, I'm not a again, like this, it doesn't affect me directly in the same way that it affects people from that region, like Ilam Tamils. It doesn't affect us, like someone like me, the same way it does someone from that region originally. But no, like it is genuinely like the way it affects me is that these are my brethren that are being killed. Like this is a guy that looks like me, that was my age, right? That was point blank executed at the hands of the Sri Lankan army. It's, it is genuinely like heartbreaking. And it is largely due to the fact that this was either it wasn't necessarily a coordinated effort, but what it was is it was outside nations that were all vying for influence in Sri Lanka, and they want economic influence in Sri Lanka. And as a result of that, they were more than willing to cooperate with whatever the Sri Lankan government told them. And also, like, the other connection between me and the people that live there is that we speak the same language. I understand what they're saying, right? Like, when those people were screaming for their moms or their relatives, that was like a relative of mine that was screaming. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that is very conceivable. That could have been like a person. And again, not to make this about me, but it is largely like that's the sort of feeling that it instills in you. And that's why, like, that sort of, there's a fire under my ass to like bring awareness to this as much as possible.
You mentioned earlier that there was in northern Tamil, in Tamil, there was a communist uprising around, not at the same time, but like at some point during the Civil War.
It wasn't in the north. So the JVP, the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, was I believe a Maoist party that rose up against basically at the time when the Black July event happened. It was Jayawardena that was in power, and Jayawardena, even though
they were in power in he was
president.
Sri Lanka or in Sri Lanka,
J.R. Jayawardena was president. J.R. Jayawardena was the president of Sri Lanka at the time. Effectively, he was the guy that started the neoliberalization of the Sri Lankan economy. And so he was actually quite allied with the United States, even though officially, Sri Lanka was part of the non-aligned movement. And the reason is America saw Sri Lanka as a sort of check against India originally. But later on, it wasn't just American involvement that became a problem. It was also like PRC involvement and Indian involvement. India originally trained the Tigers, and then they immediately sided against the Tigers later on. Like, there's a litany of countries. Like, let me pull this up just to give you an idea of which countries actually get provided and continue to provide military, either military training or weapons. All right, I'm just going to run through the list. All right, just so you understand sort of the stakes here. Right. So these are all the countries that provided special military training at any given point to Sri Lanka. All right, you ready for this? China, India, Pakistan, Russia, Israel, US, UK, Iran, and Ukraine. Those are all the countries that have at one point provided special military training during the wartime period. These are the arms suppliers. the European Union, the United States, India, United Kingdom, Pakistan, China, Iran, Israel, Russia, Australia, and North Korea.
So this sounds really familiar then. This sounds like historically how Western intervention from the United States and the imperial core and of course other nations that are less white have always interjected in the interest of their corporate benefactors to, you know, tamp down left-leaning. I don't know if Tamil was a left-leaning nation.
The Tamil, so the LTTE wasn't explicitly like a left-wing movement. What they were mainly about was an independent Tamil state. That was their most important sort of.
But they were definitely arming the right-wing element of this conflict.
They were. Yeah. So basically, the way it worked was like you could have like social democratic like economic policies, but basically the underpinning of Sri Lankan society from the get-go was Sri Lanka for the Sinhalese, and you guys are our guests, and we have a right to kick you guys out whenever you want. It didn't matter like whether it was the SLFP or the UNP, or later on it would be the SLPP. Like even and this is why I'm not a fan of the communist parties there either. The JVP, which had a communist uprising that was eventually crushed by the neoliberal government at the time. One of the problems that they had was they were eventually taken over by Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists. And eventually later on, what they did is, especially during the 2000s, what they did was Rajapaksa was running for election at the time. And they backed Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was ostensibly probably one of the most Sinhalese nationalist candidates for president at the time. He was the one that was like at the helm of the war crimes that happened in 2009. And then in 2010, the same Communist Party, which is the largest communist party in Sri Lanka, so there was, in that presidential election, what happened was it was Rajapaksa versus General Sarath Fonseca. So a general during the Civil War that also was responsible for committing these war crimes. And the JVP, the largest communist party, backed the general. They backed the general. And the campaign was literally about who committed more war crimes, basically, who was more brutal, who was tougher on the rebels, so to speak. That was effectively the 2010 presidential campaign in Sri Lanka. It was a general and the president at the end of the Civil War trying to figure out who's a worse human being.
So they backed the person who actually even got their hands bloodied.
It's horrible. That's the best way I can describe it. But the communists they always have been, and they continue to be to this day, Sinhalese dominated. And it's, to put it into perspective, even to this day, think about it this way. Imagine if like the PSL, or the socialist alternative, for example, I know they don't have any real power in the United States, and leftist parties in the United States have always been marginalized. But let's, suspend our belief for a second and imagine that the PSL was way majority white, and they refused to talk about police brutality, or they refused to talk about, or they sided with the Republicans. Imagine that for a second. Or incarceral state, prison abolition, topics.
I hate to say it, but the way some leftists act over here it's not it's not that hard to believe.
It's not hard to believe, but these guys were in power. Like these guys had some
that part is hard to believe. Unfortunately,
they had some level of power.
I'm really at a loss of words overall. People that have watched me on here, I take pauses, but like I'm seldom kind of flabbergasted and stuck for the language to express myself. But I kind of just want to speak to how universal this is, while also being like distinctly a problem for the Tamil people. But like how this is as soon as when we talked on Discord a couple of weeks ago now. And as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, this sounds like but like so many post-colonial conflicts. And it's because you have Western and capitalistic and imperialist interests in maintaining a specific disposition in the nation. And it's because these areas will have spent generations disenfranchised and underdeveloped, so that there's not a lot more to do other than have conflict, that they can't, have an uplift that is done without the intervention of Western powers. And because the creep of right-wing thought and ideology is not, it's powerful. So like there's the desire to cleave to that type of nationalistic rhetoric and ideology that makes fascism viable, especially after a decolonized situation. So it's like,
well, actually, I want to interject for a second, because there's actually so one of the things that actually I see a lot coming out of this part of the this part of the world is sort of the weaponization of, and this isn't to be like, oh, colonialism was awesome or anything like that, obviously not, but what I do see is sort of the weaponization of anti-colonial rhetoric, the actual genuine anti-colonial anger, the anger against the genuine anger against like colonization, but it's cynically weaponized by fascists to basically push their own agenda. Because what the Sinhalese nationalists are doing is they're effectively pushing their own colonization. They're pushing their own form of colonization on the North. And post-war, post-conflict time, one of the things that the government has been doing is the archaeological department will often designate areas in the North as like heritage sites or for the Sinhalese, and they will order the destruction of Tamil temples, or they'll like order the destruction of Tamil heritage sites. And what they'll do is they'll often send like a Buddhist monk to the North to basically ensure that everything is built there. The cultural sites of the Tamils are destroyed, and that the Sinhalese cultural heritage site is built on top of it. Post Civil War, you also had a bunch of what you would call the white van situation, where lots of Tamils would immediately just get kidnapped in white vans. They just get kidnapped by white vans, and then we never hear from them again. You also have the weaponization of in 1979, a law called the Prevention of Terrorism Act was passed, in basically because the LTTE was gaining popularity, and the various militant groups of the North and the East were gaining popularity as well. And so the Sri Lankan parliament basically unilaterally passed this law to basically crack down on, they would allow, they can arrest people on mere suspicion. So you have people, not just Tamils, you also have, Sinhalese and Muslims that were locked up due to this law later on. But for the vast majority of these cases, this law was largely targeted at Tamil civilians. So you had a lot of Tamil civilians that were simply accused of being affiliated with the LTTE that were locked up and thrown in jail. A few of them have only recently, they've recently, come out. They've only recently been bailed out.
Sorry, go ahead.
So on top of that as well, you also have, this new law that was recently passed called the Anti-Terrorism Act. It was passed this year. And basically what this law is the same thing as the PTA, but two major, changes are that the military is now allowed to directly arrest people. And on top of that, the death penalty has been added for quote unquote terrorist acts. So, and Sri Lanka had a moratorium on the death penalty for decades now. That is now back officially on the books. So this also was used to basically police the minority Tamils of the North. And especially recently, in one of the things that has been happening is you'll have like government-backed, settlings of the northern parts of the country. You'll have like you still have parts of the North that are still run by the military. The military opened up shops. They opened up businesses in the North. You have land, you have, farms that have been basically opened up by the military, that are run by the military. That is effectively, going on in the North. Yeah, sad state of affairs is in Ipakava Kevalmarke Amma. So it is unfortunately, like Abi says, it is a very sorry state of affairs, what is actually happening in Sri Lanka. It is effectively very similar to a lot of, what people know about, but it gets like, especially what we call the Sinhalization of the North and the East, which is this state-backed project to effectively lower the number. And then the reason they're doing this is largely because they want to reduce the Tamil representation numbers in parliament. And one of the things, one of the issues that none of these, these major parties have refused to budge on is the full implementation of the 13th Amendment, which was negotiated between India and Sri Lanka, which would actually, it's a half measure, right? But it would actually it would effectively devolve land and policing back to the provincial level. That's a half measure, right? It's not necessarily granting full autonomy, but it's a half measure to basically devolve those two things in particular back, which there has never been any political will to implement that. And it's because basically the underlying, doctrine is that Sri Lanka is for even Jaffna, which has historically been a Tamil dominated city for centuries. That is really, Tamil, that is meant to be Sinhalese effectively.
I guess as we get ready to wrap up, if I understand, the goal is just to kind of get this story out there to more mouths, eyes, and ears.
Yeah.
So what is happening now? What's an ideal thing for people to start who are of the mind and will to do something? What could they be supporting? And
Oh, that's a hard question, because
it's a very hard question. Yes,
that's a very hard question to answer. And the reason for that is, from my perspective, at least as someone that talks about this and wants to raise awareness about this, the goal is to coalition build at the very least. It's to build some sort of coalition. And I think it's to educate a lot of people on this issue, because unfortunately, I feel like I think leftists really have to get on this immediately. They have to get on this yesterday, because just recently, Justin Trudeau just said that, they announced May 18 as Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day. The problem with Canada or the United States even mentioning that is because of their track record, a lot of leftists are going to knee-jerk react and basically say, well, if these guys are saying it, if the American government is saying it, then it must be false. Which, unfortunately, sometimes it is the case that broken clocks are right twice a day. It is a very hard question to answer. And the reason is, I guess right now is just we're in a situation where no one actually even knows about what's going on here. So the best thing to do is to raise awareness, because we can't do anything. We don't even have hard numbers on the death toll towards the end of the Civil War. We don't even have hard numbers on how many people actually died. The official numbers say tens of thousands of people, but the numbers are very likely in the hundreds of thousands, right? Those are the official numbers given out by the Sri Lankan government, but the number is probably much higher than that, considering the fact that there are many disappeared persons. Read, educate, agitate. Yeah, agitate, educate, and organize, right? We in Tamil, we would say it as karpi purachi se ondru ser. But yeah, so basically the best thing to do right now is probably just to raise awareness, do as much mutual aid as possible. And I think once we, propagate this enough among, leftists, I think we can I think at that point we can figure out what to do. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think we're at a state where we can't even afford to think about that at the moment. You know what I mean?
No, it makes sense. I know one thing that was at the beginning of the doc was there's no punishment for the war crimes. Although I don't know if a UN backed
is not going to help.
Sanction will help at all.
It'll affect the majority of the population. So sanctions aren't going to help either. Right. I definitely do not want the US brass getting involved in this. I don't want the State Department getting involved in this, because the last thing we need is this to be,
another excuse to kind of give aid.
Yeah, I don't think the US is going to do that anytime soon, because of Sri Lanka's proximity to India and China. That would be a massive, geopolitical disaster for America to be that directly involved in it. But they are involved in the sense that the IMF just, gave a bailout to Sri Lanka, and the consequence for that is Sri Lanka had to privatize their airlines. So, in a sense, America's always been involved in Sri Lanka for a long time. Support Tamil refugees in your cities. Yes, that's another example. If you need, reach, like, especially if you live in like Toronto, for example. If you live in Toronto, for example, there's a vast majority of people that live in Toronto, the greater Toronto area, are going to be from this region. They're going to be from this country. How will the U.S. recognize the genocide when they supported Sri Lanka in the war? They won't. They're not going to. So what the U.S. government has done is they've actually sanctioned literal war criminals. So I think they recently sanctioned Karna Gowda. Yeah, it's like Karna says, like, there's genuinely, like, all the organizations you can't, like, a lot of it is going to be like you have to donate directly to people. And the way you can do that is by reaching out to Tamils in your organization. There's an organization called Pearl Action. I highly recommend looking them up.
Yeah, but what it sounds like is I guess the reason why the left in particular needs to get into it is because support really cannot be made through traditional or mainstream means, because
it has to be grassroots. I've always been an advocate for, grassroots movement. That's sort of the doctrine that I've always followed. I sort of follow the Andrewism school of thought on a lot of things. So support always has to. U.S. is complicit. Yeah, exactly. Like, the U.S. is also complicit in all this. They don't really care. The best way is you have to build grassroots support, and you have to also help out people that are, like, living in the country as well. As far as government involvement, I don't think there's never really been an initiative by any government. The way they'll treat the entire sort of Sinhalization of the North and East that has been going on for quite a while now is they'll just treat it as like, oh, it's a civil war by terrorists that was perpetrated by terrorists, even though it's significantly way more complicated than that. There's a lot more to the story than that. Like, to give you an example, like, most people in this chat, I don't know, maybe not in this chat, but most people I've talked to about this issue, the first two words that came out of their mouth about Sri Lanka were Tamil tigers. That's it. Those are the only two words that came out of their mouth, because all the news coverage was focused on the tigers. And to give you an idea of, like, how badly this issue has been shut out, I think someone in the chat mentioned MIA, the artist. She literally brought this up with Oprah, and Oprah quite literally said that she can't be associated with MIA because MIA is a terrorist, when MIA tried to bring this up with Oprah. That goes to, and like, everyone sort of dogpiled on MIA. And that's sort of why we are where we're at. Any discussion, like, I was talking about this on a stream earlier, and I mentioned the words Tamil genocide. And what happened was someone tried to get me banned immediately because I said those two words. Like, that's how much inertia there is among this issue. The deck is incredibly stacked. The best thing to do is I guess we have to start somewhere. So we have to educate, agitate, organize, help Tamils in your area, as people have said. The censorship regarding Tamil genocide is insane. Yeah. But basically, like, there was a person that was literally just arrested by the cops for having the word genocide on their placard or on their banner. They were literally just locked up. They were thrown in prison by the cops because they had the word genocide. That's how politicized the word is. It's technically not supposed to be an arrestable offense. It is not an arrestable offense. But the reason is
under the guise of homeland security and anti-terrorism efforts.
Yes. Yeah, it's basically, that's the reason.
All right, Arun, this was powerful and heavy. We'll get back to dumb stuff another time, chat. But I want to make sure, please, for those who are in the chat now and for those who are watching, check out what will be in the description in terms of, like, ways to further educate yourself, ways to support, and just more information around this issue. Thank everybody in the chat for being receptive and respectful. And Arun, thanks for sharing this with us. And I hope that that if we talk again, there's movement on this in some positive manner.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on to talk about this. I really appreciate it. This is it is a godsend to have someone of your stature and someone of your, being able to platform this issue, which just, I don't think there's enough coverage on this issue. So yeah, being able to actually talk about this on a broader platform, because when I first started talking about this last year, I was basically going on every platform that I can to talk about this. And I, took every opportunity I could. And it was very frustrating to not have people be receptive towards this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's frustrating to hear, because I know it's not like a what and a what, but it's such a familiar conversation.
It is.
And
It's such a relatable concept to people. Like a lot of what happened. So Noam Chomsky basically described what happened in Sri Lanka as very similar to what happened in Rwanda.
Yeah, it's the exact same story as far as well, not the exact same, right? Like, of course, it's not the exact same, but I immediately thought that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to not be disconnected from it, because it's this, and I'm sure there's stories like this that we haven't heard yet, that are happening elsewhere. Somebody mentioned Ghana earlier in the chat.
I've wanted to talk about West Papua on my stream, but I couldn't find anyone, because that's also another issue, or West Sahara. Like, those are issues that don't get any coverage. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Arun. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Be on the lookout for this. Thanks so much, everybody. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah.